I knew something was wrong the moment two armed security guards climbed over my fence instead of knocking on my front door. They claimed the HOA president had authorized them to prepare my property for demolition. The only problem was that this land had belonged to my family for over 40 years, and every document proving it was locked safely inside my house. They thought they were intimidating an old widower living alone. What they did not know was that I had spent 30 years designing construction sites, and I had prepared one trap that would expose every lie they told. My name is Walter Hayes, and before I tell you what happened on that morning when the bulldozer rolled onto my driveway, I need to tell you about the house, because the house is where everything began. It sat at the end of a quiet street called Pinecrest Lane, a single-story home with a wraparound porch that my father built with his own hands, back when this entire stretch of land was nothing but open field and a scattering of oak trees. My mother planted a garden along the east side of the house, rows of tomatoes and squash that she tended every summer evening until the day she passed. When my father followed her 6 years later, the property became mine, and I made a promise to both of them that I would never let it go, no matter what the world around it turned into. And the world around it did turn into something different. Over the following 2 decades, the open fields gave way to a planned community of nearly 300 homes, with curved streets named after birds and a homeowners association that governed everything from the color of your mailbox to the height of your grass. My house, the one my father built, sat right in the middle of it all, an old relic surrounded by vinyl siding and matching shutters. I never minded the new neighbors. Most of them were kind people, raising families, walking their dogs, waving from their cars. I spent my weekends the way I always had, repairing the porch railing, repainting the shutters, mowing the lawn until it looked sharp enough to set a level on. The neighbors knew me as the quiet old man who kept to himself but always lent a hand when someone needed one. The one who fixed Mrs. Caldwell's fence after the storm without being asked. The one who plowed the Andersons' driveway every winter because their daughter had a heart condition and could not shovel snow herself. I had worked 30 years as a civil engineer overseeing commercial construction sites across 3 states, a career that taught me patience long before patience ever became a virtue I needed at home. I retired the same spring my wife passed, a woman named Dorothy who had filled this house with warmth for 31 years before cancer took her slowly, quietly, the way it takes so many people who deserve a gentler ending. After she was gone, the garden became my way of staying close to both her memory and my mother's, the 2 women who had shaped this land long before any of the newer houses ever existed. Neighbors sometimes asked if I felt lonely out there at the end of the street, surrounded by families half my age, and I always told them the truth, that a man who has spent his life building things rarely feels alone, so long as there is still something left standing to repair. For years, that was simply my life. Then the Homeowners Association elected a new president, a woman named Diane Forsyth, and everything began to shift in ways I could not yet see coming. Diane was sharp, polished, the kind of woman who arrived at every meeting with a folder of color-coded charts and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She had moved into the community only 2 years earlier, into one of the largest homes near the entrance gate, and within months had positioned herself on every committee that existed, eventually running for president unopposed, because nobody else seemed willing to dedicate the hours she so eagerly offered. People admired her energy at first, the way she spoke in confident, sweeping sentences about the future of the neighborhood, never once pausing long enough for anyone to ask exactly how her ambitious plans would actually be funded. She had grand plans for the neighborhood, plans she described at every gathering with the kind of enthusiasm that made people nod along without asking too many questions. Her biggest project was a community park, a sprawling green space with walking trails, a pavilion, and a pond, something she promised would raise property values and make Pinecrest Lane the envy of every other development in the county. She brought in architectural renderings printed on glossy paper, passed them around the meeting room, and spoke about the project with the conviction of someone who had already decided the outcome long before any vote was ever cast. There was only one problem standing in the way of her vision. My land, the 4 acres my father had left me, sat directly in the footprint of her planned park, the one parcel in the entire community that the association did not control and could not simply vote into submission. I did not think much of it at first when the letters started arriving. The first one was polite enough, an invitation to a community planning meeting, followed by a gentle suggestion that I might consider donating or selling my property for the good of the neighborhood. I read it twice, set it on the kitchen table, and went back to repainting the porch railing, because as far as I was concerned, the conversation was already finished. This was my family's land, and it was not for sale. A week later, a second letter arrived, this one less polite, suggesting that my refusal was holding back progress for nearly 300 families. I still did not respond. because I had learned a long time ago that quiet confidence speaks louder than any argument. But Diane Forsyth was not the kind of woman who accepted silence as an answer, and the letter that arrived after that one made it clear that she intended to find another way to get what she wanted, whether I agreed to it or not. The harassment started small, the way these things always do, with a single notice taped to my front door citing a violation for the color of my porch trim, a shade of blue I had used for over 15 years without a single complaint from anyone. I paid the fine without argument, repainted the trim a shade lighter to match the new color guidelines, and thought that would be the end of it. It was not. Within 2 weeks, another notice appeared, this time accusing my mailbox of failing to meet the association's new uniform standards, despite the fact that the mailbox had been standing in that exact spot since before the Homeowners Association even existed. I measured it myself against the published guidelines and found it compliant down to the inch, photographed everything, and submitted my evidence to the board. I began to notice a pattern in how quickly each new notice arrived, almost always within days of my submitting proof that disputed the previous one, as though someone were simply waiting for one complaint to fail before manufacturing the next. Diane was not finished. The fines kept coming, one after another, each one more absurd than the last. A citation claimed my lawn had grown beyond the permitted height, though I had mowed it myself only 3 days earlier and had photographs with timestamps to prove it. Another citation claimed my fence violated setback requirements that had never applied to my property because my land predated the association's formation by decades. I fought each one with documentation, with photographs, with copies of the original deed restrictions that clearly exempted grandfathered properties like mine. Every single time, I won. And every single time, Diane Forsyth grew a little more frustrated that an old man with a tape measure and a filing cabinet kept outmaneuvering her at every turn. The fine that finally pushed things into dangerous territory involved my truck, a faded red pickup that had been parked in my own driveway for as long as anyone in the neighborhood could remember. A notice arrived claiming that visible commercial vehicles violated community aesthetic standards, despite the fact that my truck had no commercial markings whatsoever, and had never once been the subject of a complaint from any actual neighbor. I drove to the HOA office that afternoon, calm as I always tried to be, and asked to speak with Diane directly. She met me in the lobby with that same practiced smile, the one that never reached her eyes, and I asked her plainly why my property kept attracting violations that no other home in the neighborhood seemed to receive. She dropped the smile entirely then, leaning close enough that I could smell her expensive perfume, and said words I would never forget. She told me that if I did not learn to cooperate, she would make sure I could not live there anymore, that she had ways of making my life difficult that went far beyond a few parking fines. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. I simply thanked her for her honesty, turned around, and walked back to my truck, because in that moment, I understood something important. This was no longer about parking violations or paint colors. This was about my land, and Diane Forsyth was prepared to do whatever it took to get it away from me. That night, unable to sleep, I sat on my porch the way I often did, watching the stars the way my father had taught me decades earlier. It was nearly midnight when I noticed movement near the tree line at the edge of my property, a flashlight beam sweeping low across the grass, followed by the silhouette of a man kneeling with what looked like surveying equipment. I did not confront him. I simply watched from the shadows of my porch, memorizing the direction he came from and the direction he left in, before quietly retreating inside to check the footage from a small security camera I had mounted near my shed years earlier, more out of habit from my old engineering days than any real expectation of trouble. The footage was grainy but unmistakable. Someone had been measuring my land in the middle of the night, and they clearly did not want anyone to know they had been there. The following weeks confirmed what I had already begun to suspect, that this was no longer a simple dispute between a stubborn old man and an overzealous Homeowners Association president. Diane Forsyth had escalated things in a direction that felt calculated, almost professional. I began noticing unfamiliar vehicles parked near the entrance to my driveway, sleek black sedans that lingered for 20 or 30 minutes before driving away, and once, a van marked with the logo of a private security firm I had never heard of, idling at the end of Pinecrest Lane as though someone inside were studying the layout of my property. I started keeping a notebook, the way I had during my career, managing construction sites, recording dates, times, license plates, anything that might matter later, because experience had taught me that documentation was the only language people like Diane Forsyth truly respected. It was my neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Eleanor Briggs, who first told me what Diane had been saying at the community meetings I no longer bothered attending. According to Eleanor, Diane had informed the board that my land technically fell under a disputed boundary line, an old surveying error from decades earlier that the association intended to correct in the community's favor. She had gone so far as to claim that the original deed for my property contained an ambiguous description that placed a significant portion of my acreage under common area designation, language that would allow the association to seize control of it for the park project, without my consent. Eleanor said most of the board members seemed convinced, nodding along as Diane displayed maps and surveys that looked official enough to silence any objections. I drove to the county records office the very next morning and requested copies of every document related to my property, going back to the original platting of the land in the 1950s. What I found troubled me deeply. The boundary lines on the most recent survey filed with the county, the one Diane had been showing to the board, did not match the boundary lines on the original survey my father had kept in his own files for over 40 years. Someone had altered the digital record, shifting the property line by nearly 60 feet, in a way that conveniently carved out the exact section of land needed for the planned park entrance. I made copies of everything, photographed every page, and brought the discrepancy to the clerk's attention, who seemed genuinely baffled by how such an alteration could have occurred in a system that was supposed to be secure. That same week, I discovered something even more unsettling, buried in a box of old HOA newsletters that Eleanor had saved over the years. Several pages referencing the original community covenants, the ones explicitly grandfathering in properties like mine that predated the association, had been quietly removed from the official HOA archive that residents could access online. When I requested a printed copy of the full covenant document from the association office, the clerk handed me a version that conveniently lacked those same pages, claiming it was simply an updated formatting of the original. I knew better. I had a printed copy from years earlier, given to me by the very first HOA president when the community was founded, and the missing language was unmistakably present in my older version. Something larger than a parking dispute was clearly unfolding, and instinct told me I needed someone with legal expertise in my corner before things escalated any further. I called an old friend from my engineering days, a man whose daughter had become a property rights attorney known throughout the county for taking on homeowners associations that overstepped their authority. Her name was Patricia Lowell, and when I sat across from her desk and laid out everything I had gathered, the altered survey, the missing covenant pages, the nighttime surveyor, the threats from Diane herself, she leaned back in her chair and told me something that settled deep in my chest. She said that what I was describing sounded less like an aggressive homeowners association and more like a deliberate, organized fraud, the kind that could land people in serious legal trouble if proven in court. Patricia explained that fighting fraud with paperwork alone would take years. And years was exactly what Diane Forsyth was counting on, because most people simply gave up under the weight of endless letters and legal fees before any real justice could be reached. What Diane did not understand about me was that I had spent 3 decades managing some of the largest construction sites in the state, overseeing security systems, surveillance protocols, chain of custody documentation, and legal compliance standards that most people never had reason to think about. I understood cameras. I understood GPS tracking. I understood exactly how evidence needed to be captured, time-stamped, and preserved in order to hold up in a courtroom rather than simply existing as a story one old man told without proof. So instead of fighting back the way Diane expected, I did something she never saw coming. I did nothing at all, at least not outwardly. I let the fines pile up without protest. I let the surveyor return for a second nighttime visit without confronting him. I let Diane believe that her threats had finally worn me down, that the quiet old widower on Pinecrest Lane was simply too tired and too afraid to keep fighting. Patricia agreed this was exactly the right approach, advising me that the best way to expose someone determined to break the law was to give them every opportunity to do exactly that, while making absolutely certain that every single moment was captured beyond any possible dispute. Over the following 2 weeks, I quietly transformed my property into something far more sophisticated than anyone driving past would have noticed. I installed a network of weatherproof cameras along the tree line, the fence posts, and the eaves of my house, each one feeding into a secure recording system rather than anything connected to the cloud where it might be tampered with remotely. I purchased a small drone with high-definition recording capability, the kind I had once used to survey construction sites from above, and registered its flight logs through a service that stamped every recording with verified GPS coordinates and timestamps that could not be altered after the fact. I reached out to neighbors like Eleanor and the Andersons, the families who had always trusted me, and asked quietly whether their own doorbell cameras and driveway cameras might happen to capture activity near my property, a request every single one of them agreed to without hesitation. I spent evenings testing camera angles the way I once tested sightlines on active job sites, walking the perimeter with a notepad, adjusting each lens until I was certain no approach to my fence line could occur without being captured from at least 2 independent vantage points. I labeled every recording device with its own coordinates and field of view, cross-referencing them against a hand-drawn map of my property pinned to the wall of my study, the same habit I had carried with me through 3 decades of overseeing crews who never quite understood why an old engineer insisted on documenting things twice. Patricia handled the legal architecture in parallel, filing a formal complaint with the county regarding the altered survey records, while simultaneously preparing documentation that would allow law enforcement to respond immediately should any unauthorized individuals set foot on my land. She made one thing clear above everything else, that the moment any physical trespass or property damage occurred, we needed local police already aware and ready to respond, rather than scrambling to call them after the fact. I agreed completely, because I had learned long ago on construction sites that the difference between an incident report and a lawsuit often came down to exactly how quickly the right authorities arrived and exactly how much evidence was waiting for them when they did. By the time Diane Forsyth began openly discussing her plans at HOA meetings to bring in a demolition crew to clear my land for the park project, claiming the disputed boundary survey gave her legal standing to proceed, I had already quietly assembled everything required to dismantle that claim entirely. I let her keep talking. I let her keep believing that the old man on Pinecrest Lane had finally run out of fight. Patricia and I both understood that the trap was not something loud or dramatic, not something that would announce itself the way Diane probably imagined resistance would look. It was patient, it was thorough, and it was waiting for the exact moment she decided to act on her threats. The morning it finally happened arrived without warning, the way most disasters tend to, beneath a sky the color of wet concrete and a chill that hung in the air just past dawn. I was on my porch with a cup of coffee, the same routine I had followed every morning for years, when I heard the low growl of diesel engines coming down Pinecrest Lane. A bulldozer rolled into view first, followed by a flatbed truck carrying construction equipment, then a white van with the logo of the same private security firm I had photographed weeks earlier idling near my driveway. 2 men climbed out of that van wearing dark uniforms, both of them visibly armed, moving with the kind of casual confidence that told me they expected absolutely no resistance from whoever lived behind that fence. My hands stayed steady around the warm mug, though my heart had already begun to pound the way it had not pounded in years. Not since the morning Dorothy's doctor first said the word cancer out loud in a quiet office that smelled of antiseptic and bad news. I thought of her then, briefly, and of my father building this porch board by board. And I reminded myself that everything I had spent weeks preparing existed for exactly this moment, and that the cameras hidden along my fence line were already recording before either truck had even come to a full stop. Diane Forsyth arrived moments later in her silver sedan, stepping out in a blazer that looked far too polished for someone about to oversee the demolition of another person's property. She walked toward my fence line with a clipboard tucked beneath her arm, flanked by a man I recognized from the surveying crew, and called out toward my porch that the association had authorized the clearing of unauthorized structures encroaching on common area land, citing the very same falsified survey Patricia and I had already proven to be fraudulent at the county level. I set my coffee down slowly, walked to the edge of my porch, and watched without saying a word as the 2 armed guards approached my fence and began climbing over it rather than waiting for any gate to be opened. The construction crew followed close behind, one of them carrying bolt cutters toward the chains securing my side gate, while the bulldozer operator revved the engine and began maneuvering toward the section of fence nearest the garden my mother had planted decades earlier. Diane stood near the front of the group, arms crossed, watching the chaos unfold with an expression that looked almost satisfied, as though she believed this moment marked the end of a battle she had been fighting for months. She called out toward me again, her voice carrying easily across the quiet morning air, telling me that resistance would only make things worse and that it would be far simpler for everyone if I simply stepped aside and let her crew finish their work. I did not step aside, but I also did not raise my voice or move to stop them. I simply stood on my porch, arms folded, watching every single thing unfold exactly the way Patricia and I had anticipated it would. The bolt cutters severed the chain on my gate. The armed guards pushed through onto my property, weapons visible at their hips, moving toward the equipment shed near the garden. The bulldozer inched forward, its blade lowering toward the fence line my father had built with his own hands. Several of my neighbors had stepped onto their porches by now, drawn by the noise of engines and shouting, watching the scene with expressions of confusion and growing alarm, none of them quite understanding what they were witnessing. Diane finally turned toward me directly, raising her voice loud enough for everyone on the street to hear, declaring that the demolition would proceed immediately and that anyone who continued to obstruct the process would be dealt with accordingly. I let the silence stretch for a long moment, long enough that even the bulldozer operator glanced uncertainly toward Diane as though waiting for some signal that things were not quite right. Then I finally spoke, calm and steady, the same tone I had used my entire career when explaining a critical mistake to men who outranked me on paper but had never actually understood the systems they were operating within. I told her that she and everyone standing on my property had just walked directly into a trap I had been preparing for exactly this moment. Diane laughed at first, the kind of laugh meant to project confidence she clearly no longer felt, glancing toward her security guards as though expecting them to share in her dismissal of an old man's empty threat. But the laughter died quickly when the first police cruiser turned onto Pinecrest Lane, lights flashing silently, followed almost immediately by a second cruiser pulling up directly behind the security firm's idling van. Patricia had arranged everything in advance exactly as promised, alerting local law enforcement that armed trespassing and unauthorized property destruction were likely to occur that morning, providing them with documentation in advance so that responding officers would understand the legal complexity the moment they arrived on scene. The officers moved quickly, ordering the two armed guards to step away from the equipment shed and lower their weapons, their hands hovering near their own holsters until compliance was clear. One of the guards, panicking, attempted to grab a small camera mounted near my fence post, apparently hoping to destroy evidence before realizing his mistake, an action immediately noted by the responding officers as an additional offense layered atop the trespassing already underway. The bulldozer operator killed the engine without being asked twice, climbing down from the cab with his hands raised slightly, clearly understanding far better than Diane did exactly how serious this situation had become. Diane attempted to explain the situation to the officers herself, insisting that the Homeowners Association held legitimate authority over the disputed land, gesturing toward her clipboard and the survey documents she had brought along as proof. The lead officer, a woman with a calm and unshakable demeanor, asked simply for documentation proving that authority, and I watched Diane's confidence falter for the first time since this entire ordeal began, her eyes darting toward the survey papers, as though searching for words that might somehow rescue her from a situation rapidly spiraling beyond her control. I walked calmly into my house at that point, retrieved a small fireproof safe I had kept in my closet for years, and carried it out to the porch where the officers could see exactly what I intended to show them. Inside that safe sat everything Patricia and I had spent weeks preparing. The original deed to my property signed over 4 decades earlier, 40 years of consecutive property tax records proving continuous ownership, the original community covenant explicitly grandfathering my land out of association control, and a certified copy of the unaltered survey filed with the county before anyone had tampered with the digital records. I handed each document to the officers methodically, watching as their expressions shifted from procedural neutrality into something closer to disbelief as they began to understand the scale of what Diane Forsyth had apparently attempted to orchestrate. Patricia arrived moments later, having been alerted the instant the situation began unfolding, stepping out of her car with a folder of her own containing the formal fraud complaint already filed with the county clerk's office regarding the altered boundary survey. She explained calmly to the officers that the Homeowners Association had never held any legal claim whatsoever to my property, that the survey Diane was relying upon had been digitally falsified weeks earlier, and that the evidence proving this falsification had already been submitted to county authorities days before this demolition attempt occurred. Diane's face drained of color as Patricia spoke, her clipboard slipping slightly in her grip, the polished confidence that had defined every previous interaction between us finally beginning to crack under the weight of evidence she had clearly never expected anyone to assemble against her. What unfolded over the following weeks confirmed every suspicion Patricia and I had carried since the night I first watched a stranger measuring my land in the darkness. The fraud investigation that followed the failed demolition attempt uncovered a pattern of behavior far more calculated than simple greed or ambition, revealing that Diane Forsyth had been working closely with a developer interested in acquiring the parcel of land my family had owned for generations, a developer who stood to profit enormously once the community park project drove surrounding property values upward across the entire neighborhood. Investigators discovered that Diane had personally arranged for the digital alteration of the county survey records, paying a contact within a local surveying firm to shift my property boundary by precisely the amount needed to justify the association's claim over the section of land containing the proposed park entrance. The same investigation revealed that several pages of the original community covenants, the ones explicitly protecting properties like mine that predated the association's formation, had been deliberately removed from official HOA records under Diane's direct authorization, an act that several board members later admitted they had simply trusted her judgment on, without verifying the legality themselves. Forensic accountants, tracing the surveying firm's records, found a pattern of small payments made over several months, each one carefully structured to stay beneath the threshold that would normally trigger automatic financial reporting, a level of planning that investigators noted suggested this was far from the first time Diane had manipulated official records to suit her own purposes. Perhaps the most damning discovery involved financial records subpoenaed during the investigation, showing that Diane stood to receive a substantial commission from the developer once the park project moved forward and surrounding property values rose as promised. A commission disguised within consulting fees paid through a shell company registered just months before she first ran for HOA president. The private security firm she had hired, along with the construction crew that arrived that morning with bulldozers and demolition equipment, had both been paid in advance through funds quietly diverted from the association's general maintenance budget, money that homeowners across the community had contributed believing it would be used for legitimate neighborhood improvements rather than an illegal land seizure scheme. One particular detail emerged that surprised even Patricia, who had handled property disputes for over a decade and rarely seemed shocked by anything anymore. An HOA administrative assistant named Carol Whitfield, someone who had quietly processed paperwork in the background of every meeting for years, came forward voluntarily once the investigation became public, providing investigators with internal emails proving that Diane had known from the very beginning that my deed was legitimate and that the survey alteration was entirely fraudulent. Carol explained that she had stayed silent out of fear for her own job, watching Diane intimidate other employees who had previously raised concerns, until she finally could not bear staying quiet, while an elderly widower's family land was nearly bulldozed based on lies she herself had been forced to help organize on paper. News of the failed demolition and the unfolding fraud investigation spread quickly throughout the entire community, and neighbors who had once nodded politely along with Diane's grand promises about rising property values began to reconsider everything she had told them over the previous year. Eleanor Briggs admitted to me over coffee one afternoon that she had voted for Diane in the most recent HOA election specifically because of how confidently she spoke about the park project, never once questioning where the funding or the legal authority for such an ambitious plan had actually come from. I told Eleanor what I had learned a long time ago managing construction sites, that confidence and competence often look identical to people who have no reason yet to doubt them, and that the difference only becomes visible once someone finally checks the paperwork. The criminal trial that followed months later drew far more attention than I ever expected, with reporters from the regional newspaper attending alongside curious neighbors who packed the courtroom gallery on the day the surveillance footage was finally presented as evidence. I remember sitting beside Patricia at the prosecution table, my hands folded in my lap the way they always folded when I waited for inspection results on a job site decades earlier, that same blend of certainty and quiet nerves settling into my chest. Patricia walked the courtroom through every piece of documentation we had assembled, beginning with the original deed and tax records that established my ownership beyond any reasonable doubt, before moving into the digital forensics that proved exactly when and how the county survey had been altered weeks before the attempted demolition. The footage itself told a story that required almost no narration at all. Drone recordings captured aerial views of the bulldozer crossing my property line, perfectly time-stamped and synchronized with GPS coordinates that left no room for dispute about exactly where the boundary actually sat. My own perimeter cameras showed the armed guards climbing my fence rather than entering through any gate, their faces clearly visible as they moved across land that legally belonged to me alone. Eleanor's doorbell camera, along with footage from two other neighbors who had quietly agreed to help weeks earlier, captured wide-angle views of the entire scene from multiple perspectives, eliminating any possibility that the events could later be characterized as confusion or misunderstanding rather than deliberate trespass. The prosecuting attorney played the footage of the security guard attempting to grab and disable my fence camera, pausing the recording at the exact moment his hand reached toward the lens, asking the jury to consider why an innocent contractor following legitimate instructions would feel any need to destroy evidence of his own actions. Diane sat at the defense table throughout the entire presentation, her expression rigid, occasionally glancing toward the jury as though searching their faces for some sign of sympathy that never seemed to arrive. When the judge finally addressed her directly, asking why she had ordered the destruction of private property before any court had ruled on the disputed boundary claim, Diane opened her mouth to respond before closing it again, apparently unable to construct an answer that did not implicate herself further. Carol Whitfield testified next, her voice steady despite the obvious nervousness in her hands as she described the internal emails proving Diane's knowledge of the fraudulent survey, the deliberate removal of protective covenant language, and the financial arrangement with the developer that stood to benefit enormously from the failed land seizure. The jury listened in near silence as Carol explained how she had watched colleagues get pushed out of their positions for raising concerns, finally deciding that staying quiet any longer made her complicit in something she could not reconcile with her own conscience. Several jurors glanced toward Diane during this testimony, their expressions hardening in ways that suggested whatever sympathy might have existed earlier in the trial had largely evaporated by that point. When the verdict finally arrived, the jury found Diane Forsyth guilty on multiple counts related to property fraud, falsification of public records, and conspiracy to commit unlawful destruction of property, alongside additional charges connected to the financial arrangement with the developer that investigators had uncovered. The judge ordered her to pay full restitution for the cost of repairing my fence and gate, along with significant punitive damages, reflecting the deliberate and calculated nature of her actions. The private security firm lost its operating license within the county following a separate administrative hearing, while the construction company involved faced its own fines for proceeding with demolition work absent verified legal authorization. Diane was further ordered to step down immediately from her position as HOA president, barred from holding any leadership role within a homeowners association for a period of years, with the possibility of additional criminal penalties still pending further review given the scale of the fraud uncovered. I watched her be led from the courtroom that afternoon, her blazer no longer looking quite so polished, her eyes finally meeting mine for just a moment before she looked away, and I felt no satisfaction in that look, only a tired kind of relief that the truth had finally been allowed to speak for itself after months of being buried beneath confident lies. A full year passed before I finally felt the weight of that entire ordeal begin to lift from my shoulders, the kind of slow healing that comes not from a single dramatic moment, but from the quiet accumulation of ordinary days spent simply living the life I had always wanted to live on the land my parents left me. My fence stood repaired, sturdier now than it had ever been before, and the garden my mother once tended along the east side of the house bloomed again that spring, tomatoes and squash rising from soil that had weathered far more than any storm the weather itself could have thrown at it. I spent my weekends the same way I always had, repainting trim, mending fence posts, mowing grass until it looked sharp enough to set a level against, except now the work felt different, lighter somehow, no longer shadowed by the constant threat of another fraudulent notice arriving in my mailbox. The Homeowners Association elected new leadership that following spring, a quiet, careful man named Robert Mercer, who had lived in the community for over a decade and had grown increasingly uneasy with Diane's leadership long before any of the fraud came to light. Robert reached out to me personally, not long after taking office, asking whether I would be willing to sit on a newly formed oversight committee designed to review association decisions with far greater transparency than had existed under the previous administration. I agreed, not out of any desire for authority or recognition, but because I understood something Diane never had, that protecting a community meant protecting every single person within it, not just the ones whose interests happened to align with personal ambition. The committee met monthly in the same room where Diane had once unrolled her glossy renderings of the planned park, except now every proposal required 2 independent signatures, every budget line item required public review, and every survey or boundary claim required verification through the county before ever reaching a vote. Simple safeguards that should have existed from the very beginning. Eleanor Briggs became one of my closest friends throughout that year, the two of us sharing coffee on my porch most Saturday mornings, talking about everything from her grandchildren to the new covenant language the committee had drafted explicitly, protecting grandfathered properties from ever facing the kind of ambiguous boundary disputes that had nearly cost me everything. She told me once, sitting in the same chair her late husband used to occupy before he passed, that watching the entire ordeal unfold had taught her more about genuine community than any neighborhood gathering or planning meeting ever had, because it showed her clearly who actually cared about their neighbors, and who merely wore the appearance of caring while pursuing something else entirely underneath. One afternoon in late autumn, a man I recognized vaguely from the crowd that had gathered the morning of the failed demolition walked slowly up my driveway, hat in his hands, clearly uncertain about whether he would even be welcome. He introduced himself as Frank Dillard, one of the neighbors who had stood silently on his porch that morning watching armed guards climb my fence, someone who admitted he had believed Diane's claims about disputed boundaries simply because he never imagined an HOA president capable of orchestrating something so deliberately dishonest. He apologized for not speaking up sooner, for not asking harder questions when the fines against my property first started appearing months before any of this began, and I told him what I had come to understand fully myself over the course of that long and difficult year, that most people are not cowards. They simply trust too easily, and trust is not something anyone should ever be ashamed of carrying. Standing on my porch that evening after Frank left, watching the sun lower itself behind the oak trees, my father had refused to cut down decades earlier despite countless requests from early developers. I thought about everything that land had witnessed across more than 4 decades of my family's life upon it. It had watched my mother plant her garden every spring, and my father build a porch with hands calloused from honest work. It had watched 2 armed men climb a fence believing intimidation alone would be enough to take what never belonged to them. And it had watched, in the end, the simple, patient accumulation of evidence outlast every threat, every fraudulent document, every ounce of manufactured confidence Diane Forsyth had ever projected. I sometimes think about what might have happened had I not spent 30 years learning how systems fail and how evidence survives. Had I been someone less familiar with cameras and timestamps and chains of custody, someone who simply trusted that doing nothing wrong would be enough protection on its own. I think about Frank, and about how many neighbors like him exist everywhere. Decent people who simply believed the wrong voice because it spoke the loudest and the most often. The lesson the land taught me that year was not really about fences or surveys or courtrooms at all. It was about the quiet difference between confidence and truth, and how easily one can be mistaken for the other until someone finally takes the time to check. Land can make people greedy, I told Eleanor one final time before she headed home that night, but the truth always stands sturdier than any fence built to keep it out. She smiled at that, the way she always did, and walked back toward her own porch light glowing warm against the coming darkness. I stayed outside a while longer, listening to the crickets gathering in the grass my mother once tended, watching the stars emerge one by one over a piece of land that had outlasted every person who ever tried to take it by force, and would likely outlast me as well, the way good land always does, patient and unmoved, waiting only for someone willing to protect it properly.